Hey folks, welcome back to the channel. Today I am coming to you with a list inspired by a bunch of videos that I've watched on YouTube recently, and it's a list of 10 books that I just don't see get any exposure or very minimal exposure at best on BookTube. Um, Maybe saying that these are just completely forgotten is a bit of an overstatement, but sometimes it feels like that because I feel like I watch a lot of content because I'm always looking for more books to just keep an eye out for. And like a lot of the list that I see there, it's like if every 10 picks, it's just like I've seen 8 or 9 of them before, over and over and over and over. It's just sometimes it's like a repetitive, just recurring echo chamber kind of nightmare story. So I thought I'd just take the time to highlight 10 really good trilogies I've enjoyed in the past, that people don't really seem to talk about. So right off the bat, the first one. Oh, and these are in like no particular order, by the way. But yeah, first one I want to highlight is China Miéville's New Robinson slash Baslag novels, and these are Perdido Street Station, The Scar, and Iron Council. So China Miéville is just an absolutely amazing author. Like reading one of his books is as much a joy as it is an experience. Like you're there's no way you don't walk away from it without some without a lot to think about, or at the very least a new word learned. Um, this trilogy in particular, it's very significant for me because I remember reading it for the first time a few years ago, and The Scar in particular, the second book, it was just so stunning at the time when I read it that it broke fantasy for me. Like I couldn't, after reading this book, like I was just so shell shocked that I carried on reading my usual genre picks, and none of them could really make me care the way after the experience I had with this book. Like I just started 2 starring on 1 star in so many books that I just stopped. I eventually just stopped reading fantasy for what I thought would be a little bit, and then 4 years passed, and until I started reading fantasy again. Um, so yeah, definitely a trilogy worth checking out. Perdido Street Station can be a bit intense to get into. It does. It's not a very forgiving book initially, but when it clicks, it just really gets you going. And then The Scar and Iron Council just pick it up from there and keep things going. These novels are extremely loosely connected. If it wasn't like advertised that they're part of a trilogy, you probably couldn't tell, other than maybe the occasional recurring element. But you can read them all as standalone, it doesn't matter. They're all worth the read. The Scar in particular. But yeah, the second trilogy I want to talk about is a trilogy from Juliet Marillier, and that is the Blackthorn and Grimm novels. This is a trilogy that it's been on my radar for a few years now. I think she released the first one sometime like 2016, 2018. So since around then, and I finally got around to reading them this year, and it was an absolute dark horse of an experience for me. I was just completely blown away by how much I thoroughly enjoyed this trilogy. It follows the experiences of a irascible healer named Blackthorn and her companion Grimm as they flee a certain injustice that was done to Blackthorn, and they find a way to build a new life. And along the way, they have these 3 adventures that really bring them directly into conflict with some of the stranger aspects of fairy. Think fairy as in Faerie. So like old, deep, wild magic. They come into conflict with, and it's just these amazing stories. Like Blackthorn is an amazing character. She's just so she there's just something spellbinding about reading her what she goes through and how she develops from there. And this is just an amazing series from start to finish. Highly recommended. My number 8 pick is a fantasy classic that really needs to be read more, and that is Mervyn Peake's Gormenghast trilogy. This is just a weird, macabre, eldritch series of novels. It's a little more than 3 books. Like, I think there's a fourth, Boy in Darkness, and then there was another one afterwards. But this is the core trilogy. The other two, the author was, they weren't completed by the author, so I don't really count them. This is a contained story within these 3 books, and it's just this brooding, weird novel. It's going to be unlike anything you've ever read. It's all about just this atmosphere and this writing style that it's not like overtly fantastic. It's just the way that this book is. This book, everything about this book and these characters is portrayed to you that you can't. It's just spellbindingly done. It's literary fantasy, but I feel like it's fantasy you need to experience for yourself to really find out if it works for you. You're either gonna love these books or they're just not going to work for you whatsoever. There's no middle ground, and they are very much worth to read. They're fantasy what could have been before Tolkien made epic fantasy like before Tolkien and Terry Brooks made epic fantasy kind of like the de facto for fantasy for the fantasy genre for decades to come. My next trilogy is one I do see it around Goodreads a little bit here and there. Not as many people talk about it as I like, given just how stunning it is. And I suspect it's because it's probably more popular in the among channels that aren't really frequented by myself and like fantasy readers like me who have my kind of interests. And this is the Daevabad trilogy by Shannon Chakraborty. Now, this is a trilogy of Arabian-inspired fantasy novels that focus on Nari, this Egyptian girl who she flees after a certain very unusual event happens to her, and she flees towards this city called Daevabad, which is like the home base of the jinn in this world. And it's just this deeply magical political fantasy that just incorporates so many themes and things and so many themes and concepts that it is just an extremely rich, extremely captivating read. It's layered, complex. It will make you think a lot from start to finish, and it's also a really amazing ride, and it's just wonderfully, brilliantly done. It's kind of amazing to think that this is a debut trilogy from an author. Like there's not many debuts of this caliber I've ever read, if any other that I can think of. It's just incredible. And yeah, highly worth checking out, especially if like you're a fan of high fantasy, political machinations, that kind of thing. Just brilliantly done. That was number 7. Number 6 is Stephen R. Donaldson's The Tales of Thomas Coffin and the Unbeliever. So this might be a somewhat debatable choice to put on this list. These books are not well liked by a lot of people for, I have to admit, very valid reasons. They're very unforgiving novels. Like, some things are included in here that you could argue are completely gratuitous. unnecessary. For me, it's just in keeping with the character that the main character that we have. Like Thomas Covenant is, he's just a repulsive guy, and he's not repulsive in the sense of being like the evil main character or being like an anti-hero. He's just a scumbag, to put it lightly, and it makes for a very interesting choice of MC, because like throughout this entire book, you don't like this guy, but you just kind of have to work with him, and the joy that you get out of this book comes more from the unfolding of the story, which is a really good story. And throughout this entire book, you get the sense that as much as like this world is relying on Thomas Covenant, they're really just choosing the lesser of two evils, and even then, it's not much of a choice. It's they just endure him for the sake of defeating what they see at that point in time as a greater evil. It's a really incredible trilogy. Honestly, worth the read. It's definitely on the older side, and I can easily see why some readers may choose to not read these books. I don't blame them, but I do think they are worth the read, worth checking out, especially like if you're a huge fantasy fan, because they are pretty influential as classics of the genre, and yeah, worth checking out. See if they're worth for you. See if there's something you might be interested in. The next trilogy I want to talk about is Elizabeth Beer's The Lotus Kingdoms. Now, this is a trilogy that's set in the world of her Eternal Sky trilogy. So the Eternal Sky trilogy is like this Mongol-inspired epic fantasy that it's essentially like a fictionalized version of The Rise of Genghis Khan. And The Lotus Kingdoms is a trilogy set within that world that takes place in a different part of the world. So there's not much to bind them together, other than a few key elements, a few mainly of the world building. Like there's one scene in particular where, as the characters in the Lotus Kingdoms travel, we do realize that these worlds are, as much as they exist on the same plane, they're for all intents and purposes completely different worlds. It's really interesting. I don't think I've ever read of something like that happening in fantasy before, but it's a really good trilogy. Elizabeth Beer is a really great underestimated author, and with this epic fantasy trilogy, she gives us Asian inspired, because it is kind of South Asian inspired, very very faint. Like you can see the traces of it there, and it's just an incredible trilogy from start to finish. Really fun epic fantasy with some unusual and interesting world building, and a story that from start to finish was just compelling and intriguing, to say the least. I just had a blast with it from start to finish. But yeah, that's the Lotus Kingdoms trilogy by Elizabeth Beer. My number 4 pick is another classic of the genre, and it's Terry Brooks's original genre trilogy. Now, I think these books are fun to read, mainly because they're quote unquote responsible for like the birth of epic fantasy as we know it. Like, yeah, Tolkien wrote Lord of the Rings, and that kind of started everything, but Terry Brooks was the guy who took Tolkien's rich, provocative prose, and for want of a better term, he simplified it and made it more accessible to the average consumer. He, working with Del Rey, also like in terms of like their production and the availability of copies. Like they were able to get the same story, effectively the same story, into the hands of more readers, and it inspired a generation from there. So to say this trilogy is iconic, in terms of what it did for fantasy, is to put it mildly. That being said, it's worth the read to see, just as, because it does introduce us to Terry Brooks' world of genre. Um, the first the first book in the trilogy is The Sword of Shannara, which is essentially the plot of Lord of the Rings. All three books condensed down into one story, simplified with a very thin coat of paint on it. Like, you're not going to read a unique story here. It is literally Lord of the Rings with a paint job. And from that book, from the second book, I think it was the Elfstones of Shannara is the second book, and then Wish Songs is the third. Well, from the second book, the Elfstones, is when Terry Brooks really starts to make this world his own. Like, we still get a plot very similar to Lord of the Rings, but there's enough twists in there that it starts to feel much more like its own story. And overall, it's just a really good, a really fun trilogy to read. And like I said, it's very iconic for the genre. If you're like a huge fantasy fan, it's worth reading just for the experience, at minimum. And if you're like an older fan, you probably have like a lot of nostalgia for this trilogy. And I think even like modern readers, like it's probably not going to blow you out of the water. Like, I find most modern readers, their tastes run more to like this kind of gritty, this gritty epic kind of story that's just not in these novels. But they are fun for what they are. They are an enjoyable read, and I do recommend checking them out. My number three pick is probably one of the most underrated high fantasy trilogies of all time. And I do very specifically use the phrase high fantasy because the marketing around this trilogy has just been terrible. These are very much epic high fantasy stories that were taken and pushed towards the wrong crowd, or to at least like a different crowd. Like, they're a victim of the biases that used to pervade fantasy. And it's Jacqueline Carey's Fedra trilogy that starts with Kushiel's Dart. Now, on the cover, especially with that particular cover that you're going to see there, like, it's very targeted more towards like the adult female romance crowd. Maybe like the paranormal romance, maybe like it looks like a smart book kind of thing, and there is a fair amount of sex in here, but and a little bit of romance. But first and foremost, these are high fantasy books. Like, it's the entire from start to finish, the majority of the book is just a lot of political machinations. Our main character is a courtesan who was trained, who was bought and trained specifically to be a spy and to work among the nobility and to just go knee deep in intrigue. And it kicks off a really amazing trilogy that has just these rich, incredible moments. Just these captivating, engaging, unique moments. It's just really good high fantasy. Like, if you're a fan of like hugely character-driven stories, of political novels of political intrigue, that kind of thing, this is a trilogy. Just ignore the cover arts. This is a trilogy worth checking out. And it's a story that bleeds a bit into epic fantasy in terms of the scope of which it eventually expands to kind of partake in. Because, like, at this point I've read two trilogies by Jacqueline Carey, both the Fedra trilogy and the sequel trilogy. And what I can say is that these stories starts with like a small character focus, and then they just evolve into this sequence of events that they just have massive ramifications for the world around them. Um, the first trilogy is a bit more magical than the second one, and then the second one it really kicks you out of left field with some of the things that goes on. Overall, just a really wonderful high fantasy trilogy, and I will keep emphasizing high fantasy. Don't look at these books and assume it's romance, it's smut, nothing of the sort. Yes, there are elements in there, but they're truly not that relevant to just how breathtaking, how captivating these stories are. Absolutely worth checking out. And I really do wish more more high fantasy and epic fantasy fans would check these books out. Um, my number 2 pick is R.A. Salvatore's Dark Elf trilogy, which in publication order is the second trilogy he wrote, but in chronological order is the first trilogy of the novels featuring Drizzt. Probably the most iconic Forgotten Realms character setting, whatever you want to call it. Drizzt is probably the most iconic Forgotten Realms character in terms of like novelizations. Now, yes, these are Forgotten Realms books, but they occupy a very significant place, similar to Timothy Zahn's Heir to the Empire trilogy, in that they may have started out as like this fan fiction in like a shared world kind of setting, but they kind of cross the boundary into more genre staples, because they're just so good. Like the Dark Elf trilogy is the only trilogy I've read from R.A. Salvatore so far, but it just blew me out of the water. Like I can't believe I read a fair bit of shared world fantasy, like right behind here. Before I throw up the cover art here, you'll notice like I have the entire collection of Legend of the Five Rings, those fantasy novels. But for example, but it's just amazing how really good this story was from start to finish over the course of this trilogy, and it just spells only good things for this series, because it is a series I will continue reading. Like I think there's about 40 books featuring Drizzt at this point, and I am going to read them all because it's just so ridiculously good. It's a series I did see crop up a little more recently on BookTube. I'd already put together this list and I wasn't about to change it though, because as much as this is like a classic fantasy, an older fantasy pick, it is very much a ridiculously entertaining series that I think a lot of fans will enjoy. And it holds up. It's kind of crazy how well it holds up to this day. Yeah, that's number 2. And then finally, my last remaining pick for trilogies that seem to be completely forgotten by YouTube, BookTube, whatever you want to call it, is a trilogy that I have yet to see featured in a single other BookTube video that I've watched. And that is Barry Ugert's Chronicles of Master Lee and Number 10 Ox. Now, this is just a absolutely mythic, hilarious, I would say visionary riff on ancient China. It's a trilogy of novels that both pay homage to, and they very irreverently just riff ancient China, the tropes and just everything that you would associate with. Like if you ever watch like an old kung fu movie, you get an idea of like the fun that these books have. Just this over the top flamboyant abundance, from start to finish. They just they just have such joy with. They're really great adventure stories, done, like if you're a fan of Terry Pratchett or Tom Holt, like that kind of comic writing. They're a trilogy of novels, loosely interconnected. They basically only feature the same main characters, who go on a series of adventures that have mythic proportions, and it's always with this hilarious comedic twist to it, both in the writing, in the series of events that happens, the dialogue, everything. It's just such a built-in part of it, like the later Terry Pratchett novels, that it's just really fun to read from start to finish. The first book, Bridge of Birds, it won the World Fantasy Award the year it was published, and with good reason, because it's just a really fun, captivating story. It's a trilogy I really wish could see the light of day more, and I do think certain fans of fantasy will find this series tremendously fun, tremendously enjoyable. Could something like this get published in this day and age? Probably not. Does that change the fact that these books are amazing? Nope. Absolutely worth checking out. And yeah, that's a list of 10 trilogies that seem to be forgotten, for lack of a better term, by BookTube. If you've read pretty much all the usual standard fantasy recommendations that you think that you're tired of seeing this brought up over and over and over, this is a list of trilogies that you can check out. I specifically picked trilogies that way, like, it's not a huge commitment by fantasy standards, just a fun ride from start to finish. So these stories, I also all pick stories that they bring something different to the table. Some are high fantasy, some are adventures, some are more thoughtful picks, some are more literary. Some the methods in which they approach fantasy, their take on fantasy is different. Some are more atmospheric, some are more overt, some are more sword and sorcery action packed, some are more political intrigue, that kind of thing. Like these 10 trilogies will give you a pretty good taste of the fantasy genre as a whole, from one end of the range to the other. And they're probably trilogies you'll almost likely never hear other booktubers mention. But yeah, if you've read any of these, if you're interested in any of these, let me know in the comments. And if by some miracle you've made it this far into the video, it seems this is probably going to be the longest video I've ever posted on this channel at this point. Drop a comment, let me know what you think, and if you've made this far, thank you very much for watching.